Hello, how's it going? Today I'm wearing one of my favorite t-shirts, which is my Bartleby the Scrivener t-shirt. If you know that classic short story by Herman Melville about non-violent resistance to the overall corporate capitalist sort of system. It's such a brilliant short story, one that I really loved ever since I was a teenager, and yeah, so brilliant. Anyway, I hope you read some good things over the month of April. If you want to let me know in the comments below the best thing you read in April, I would really love to hear about it. Or maybe the worst thing if you had some really bad reading experience. But I devoted myself strictly to book prize reading over the month of April. So I had some very varied experiences, some of them not so good, but some of these books I think are the best books that I read this year so far. So definitely prize worthy. But yeah, a big mixture of books, and so I think it's like 10 books in all on all that I've read. Yeah, so starting off, I'll talk about some that were longlisted for the Booker International Prize, and some of these, one of these has now been shortlisted anyway, but the first is The Pearfield by Nana Ekvtimishvili, translated by Elizabeth Highway, and this is a novel set in the country of Georgia and in a school for intellectually disabled children, or at least that's what it's called. Not all of the children in this school are intellectually disabled. It's more just sort of victims of circumstance, that this is where they've ended up and they have nowhere else to go. And yeah, and so it shows the range of life at this school, mainly focusing on an 18-year-old girl who's lived there pretty much her whole life, and then a boy who's about half her age, who she feels very protective about, and you follow their stories. And I think it's quite striking how she captures in this the somewhat innocence of the children, and some of the times they just seem like wholesome, like innocent children like any other, but then other times the real horrible violence and awfulness of their situation, because this school is very understaffed, and yeah, and it's mainly run by this like violent system. The heads of the school sort of pilfer the funds for themselves, and a lot of the children are left like sort of scrambling and fighting amongst each other, and there's a lot of physical violence and sexual violence, and that is quite bracing to read about. It's quite a serious, realistic novel in that way, though there are touches of warmth and humor in some of the interactions between the children, especially between this 18-year-old girl and her younger friend, and how she wants to help him to get out of this system. And one of the most heartbreaking things about this novel is the depiction of this boy who is waiting for his mother to return, and he keeps hoping and hoping she will return to him, and he speaks to her on the phone and she says she's gonna come back soon, but she's not coming back soon, and she keeps lying to him. And yeah, that is one of the most heartbreaking things to read about this novel. And yeah, and I thought it was quite good overall. It was really interesting to get this slice of life from the Society of Georgia after reading Nina Haratichvili's novel The Eighth Life last year, this great big Georgian family epic. And this is a much more slimmed down novel and story than that. And yeah, it's quite a harsh, bitter novel, but yeah, quite a powerful one. The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, and translated by Megan McDowell. So this is a collection of Argentinian short stories, and that are quite surreal sometimes in tone, sort of verging into the horror, and they're about a whole range of characters, but often involve elements of the supernatural, where a ghost or a spirit or a curse will come into the story, and often without any particular sort of moral code about it. It's not like it's these aren't like tales of vengeance in the sort of strictest sort of like moral sense. It's more about this like chaotic world and chaotic society, and the aftermath and effects of that. And yeah, and thought these were quite interesting and inventive, a lot of the short stories, but a lot of them felt a bit gimmicky to me because quite often, like at the end of the story, there'll be some sort of twist or something that'll be so horrific and like or suggest something that was going to happen, which is so horrific that it felt, yeah, just sort of like a gimmick to like say this, although I know it is like depicting some of the imbalances in society and giving voice to people that aren't often depicted in fiction. But on the whole, I just felt like it was more about the twists in these stories than it was about any sort of overall message of the story. Though the short story I liked best was actually the last short story in the collection. So I'm sort of glad that I read this all the way through because I wanted to read it all the way through for reading the International Booker Prize. And yeah, the final story was Back When We Talked to the Dead, which is about a group of girls that are used a Ouija board at one point to try to speak to the dead and speak to people that they'd lost in their lives. And yeah, and I felt like this really got the creepiness of that without like tipping over into making it like gratuitous in a way of going into the violence of it. And yeah, and I thought that was quite effective. And I also really liked the longest short story in the collection called Kids Who Come Back, about a woman who works in this department for lost children, this like archive of lost children, and then suddenly at one point all the children come back, but the children aren't as they were before, and it causes all sorts of disruption in the community. And yeah, and I thought that was quite interesting, and it did make me want to read something longer by this writer. I think her only work, fictional work, has been 2 collections of short stories that's been translated into English, but I think she has written some novels in Spanish. But I believe I've been told by an editor at Granta that published this book that they are translating a full-length novel by her. So yeah, I'll be really excited to read that when that comes out, though I think that might be a couple years away or a year and a half away or so. But yeah, but on the whole, quite interesting. But yeah, and some of the stories just went into sort of gross out details in a way that I thought was kind of unnecessary. Yeah, I thought it was yeah, interesting experience, but just not entirely successful for me. And then finally, from the International Booker Prize list, At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop, translated by Anna Mashovakis. And this novel, wow, it's so powerful. And I was sort of, when I made a video talking about the International Booker Prize, I was still reeling from the power of this book that depicts 2 Senegalese soldiers fighting during World War I for the French against the Germans. And at the very beginning of the novel, one of the soldiers' friends has just died, and he's standing over his dead body, and it's incredibly violent and horrible, him looking at his dying friend, and his friend is begging him to kill him because he's mortally wounded. He's in so much pain, he just wants to die, and his friend can't bring himself to kill him. And then his friend just sort of snaps after this. After his friend finally dies, he goes on a killing spree and goes to fight against the Germans, and is sort of becomes like an assassin, going into the German camp and killing individual Germans. And so it's a very violent, and but there's a real reasoning behind it, and it's almost philosophical in tone, because it's talking about what it means to be human and what it means to be inhuman, and what happens to our humanity within the context of war, and what that does to the mentality and the spirits of soldiers fighting in war. And yeah, so there's all these layers to it, and also there's this racial layer to it as well, because they are Senegalese soldiers fighting for the French, and the French want to use these soldiers as well. They sort of put them at the front in battles so that they're the most vulnerable and likely to die first, but also tell these soldiers to present themselves as savages to the enemies. It's sort of playing up this racial stereotype in order to freak out and scare the enemies even more. And so in a sense, that's what this soldier becomes, and he becomes kind of a savage, killing these German soldiers in a way that at first his fellow soldiers think is really great and really brave. And then when he keeps going and takes trophies of the hands of these soldiers, they see that no, actually he's like quite unhinged, and become quite afraid of him. And his commanding officer sort of tells him off and says, you have to play by the rules of war. And that sort of gets into the absurdity of like, well, what are the rules of war when people are just killing each other? Like it seems sort of absurd in a way that, yeah, there are these strict rules that you should go by in how the enemy should be killed and how they shouldn't be killed. And yeah, so it raises all these interesting questions like that. But yeah, just the way it gets at the humanity of this soldier as he's coming undone is just brilliant. And especially towards the end of the book, I think it's so interesting. It sort of switches up and it goes more into his past and is thinking about his personal history and his cultural history and where he came from, and is going into the detail of that in a way which I think is so interesting. And yeah, so for such a slim novel, it is incredibly powerful and moving, and is just one of the most incredible books I've read in recent times. And I also read the rest of the books on the Women's Prize long list that I hadn't read before April. So there is Nothing But Blue Sky by Kathleen MacMahon. And so this novel is about a middle-aged man, Irish man, who's grieving for his lost wife, and he goes on holiday with his friends, as he always did with his wife, but now his wife's not with him because she died in a tragic accident. And you find out the details of what happened to her over the course of the novel. That's kind of gradually revealed, and but it was a sudden tragic incident that took her away from him. So it was very unexpected. And yeah, she follows the pattern and the course of his grief in quite a moving and effective way, I think. But as I talked about with Anna, like a big problem I had with this book is just I didn't find him a very sympathetic character or a very interesting character to read about, me personally. And I think that is just because I feel like I know men like this already so intimately that I wasn't really learning or finding out anything new from this. I mean, she does paint him in a very sympathetic light, but yeah, he's just not the kind of character I'm like interested in reading about. Like, quite frankly, I'm just interested in reading about characters that are very different from myself. Like I can recognize some commonalities in experience and like emotions, but yeah, I like to read about people different from myself so I can get a sense of other people's lives. And this just wasn't an individual that I was all that interested in, though I sort of wonder, because I think that this is exactly the kind of character that Anne Tyler often writes about. And I love Anne Tyler's writing, and I have to say I think Anne Tyler writes about this kind of character and this kind of experience much better than this author did, although it is a good book, I think. But yeah, just I just got a bit bored by it, and wasn't interested in following his journey. And there are sort of twists and turns. He finds out more things about his own life and family that he didn't know about, and that says something more about his relationship with his wife, and how he realizes that his relationship wasn't so idyllic as he thought it was when she was alive, and finding out that really they had quite a troubled relationship and that had been sort of deteriorating in some ways over time. And in a way, I think that's really admirable to show how there can be this slow deterioration of a relationship over time. And that's quite interesting to do. But yeah, just the way she wrote it in this, the experience she captured of his life just didn't quite grab me, and so yeah, just wasn't that moved or interested in this novel. Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers. And so yeah, as I've talked about a lot already, I had some quite big issues with the ending of this novel, but I have to say, and I to speak up in its defense, like the bulk of this novel is really good, and I was gripped and moved and really interested in all of it, following a woman who is a journalist and who cares for her very difficult mother that she lives with and is sort of her mother's primary carer. And this is a really interesting situation to read about, because especially since last year I read the memoir Fragments of My Father by Sam Mills, which is all about being an adult child caring for your parent who is deteriorating in health, whether it's mental or physical health, but you're their primary carer, and how there's just not really a support network for her in helping care for her mother, and yeah, and how this is a really big issue in society. And I think she writes about that in a really sympathetic and interesting way. And at one point, she and her mother go on this sort of mini holiday, and they encounter another adult woman and her older mother, who is also in a sort of much worse situation, and yeah, and the daughter's having a really difficult time caring for her mother, and you get this other perspective on this situation where there are people that are still caring for their parents and need some support to help care for their parents, but there's not the infrastructure there to really help them. And yeah, so I thought that was really moving and interestingly done. And another thing I thought was really great about this novel was there's a whole same-sex relationship which has been sort of like under wraps for a really long time, and then it sort of comes out, and then things don't go quite as expected. And I don't want to spoil the plot, that's why I'm being so cryptic about it, but yeah, how it explores that same-sex relationship I thought was done in a really sympathetic and interesting way as well. And so yeah, so much about this novel I found really moving, and the whole tone of the novel is just quite delicately done and really emotional. And so when it gets to the end and the sort of shocker of the end, and it just, yeah, I felt quite upset by it, and really like it was a real betrayal. And I know some people have argued that, you know, this connects with the very beginning of the book, and also if you think about it, of going beyond the last page of this story, that it will sort of change things in terms of what's going to be in the headlines of a newspaper. And I know that, and because the author says so in herself, the afterword, that you should think about that. And yes, I did think about that, but I don't think that warrants what she did at the very ending of this novel. And yeah, it just didn't work for me. I felt like it was a real betrayal of both the characters and me as a reader, or all readers. And yeah, so which was such a shame. But I would be really interested to read something else by Claire Chambers, because I think she is on the whole a really good author. And I know that decision of the ending of the novel was made probably with a lot of thought, but just it came across to me as something that was just slapped on to the end of the novel, unfortunately. Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. What a shame this hasn't made it to the shortlist for the Women's Prize, because yeah, I think this is one of the most extraordinary novels I've read so far this year. Such a powerful story, so complex, and deals with really complex issues, but does so in such an engaging way, and the novel is often quite funny and humorous at times. And I think to get that tone is so difficult in a novel, and Torrey Peters does that so well. And so yeah, but I think it's funny in a way when you think about it on the outside. This is quite like a traditional story in that there's the character is pregnant, and the other characters around her have to adjust and say, oh, what are we going to do about this pregnancy? How are we going to form this family unit or not? So Katrina is pregnant, and by Ames, who's a co-worker of hers, who actually works under her, which makes a level of complication. But Ames used to be Amy, and when Amy was a trans woman, but then transitioned to being a man, and when Ames was Amy, Amy had a relationship with Reese, and Reese is a trans woman, and who is quite chaotic, I guess you could say, or who has a very complicated life and complicated personal life, has complicated romantic relationships, and so it makes quite a complicated situation because they decide they want to form a family unit with each other, and I feel like I'm explaining this quite badly, but that's because it's quite a complicated situation, but I think it's sort of funny and interesting when that you think about it on the outside. It's just this traditional story about a baby that's coming along, and the chapters are sort of counting down after the conception of this baby, going towards the pregnancy and the decision of whether they're going to have this baby or not, and if they do have this baby, will it be formed as a couple of just Katrina and Ames, or will Reese be a part of it, since Reese has these real maternal instincts which she's never been able to realize because she's a trans woman, and she and Amy tried to look into surrogacy or having a child another way, or adoption, but weren't successful in doing that, because it's quite difficult, so like gets into all of these issues, and a lot of issues to do with the lives of trans women in a really moving and powerful way, and it explores mostly the history of Ames and Reese, and their sort of how they got to this point in their lives, and talking about their backstories, and you get a lot of flashbacks to their backstories, and some of the scenes involving Ames' backstory I found so moving and powerful, and that I could really connect with in a lot of different ways, even though Ames' situation is very, very different from my own, but I was still able to connect with this, the sense of trying to discover yourself through your sexuality, through actually having sex, how having sex is this continuous process of discovering ourselves and learning about ourselves and learning about what we really desire, because it's this real confrontation where you have to admit to what you really desire, and what really excites you, and it explains that and goes into it in a really effective way, that I thought was so moving, interesting, and so it was wholly wrapped up and engaged in this book, and want to go back and reread it at some point, because I want to get more of the layers of it, and I think it's such a richly rewarding reading experience. Then there is Because of You by Dawn French, which is sort of interesting to talk about these books in comparison with each other, because they're in a way polar opposites, even though they're both about motherhood. And so Dawn French's book begins with two women in a hospital giving birth to newborn girls, but these births have very different outcomes from them, and that leads to dramatic results. And so then it skips forward far into the future, and follows how they're going on in their lives. And I sort of don't want to give any spoilers for this, so I'm going to remain quite vague about the details. But I thought at first this story was quite moving, but then the more it got into it, the more it felt like it was sort of soap opera-ish twists in the story, which were there more for the plot than for the emotional complexity of the characters. And I thought the use of humor in this was a bit jarring at times. It felt like it wasn't staying true to the real complexity of the situation, like it did in Detransition Baby. Like it was, it felt like it was a bit more frivolous. Though there are some very touching and moving moments in the novel, but especially towards the end, there are a series of twists which felt so over the top soap opera-ish that I just couldn't really emotionally invest in them, and felt like it was way too over the top. How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones, and this novel has made it onto the shortlist for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which I wasn't really expecting, but I'm not mad to see it there. I think it is a very good, very powerful novel, but it is such a dark novel, such a bleak novel in its tone, because there is so much violence in it, really horrific sexual violence in a domestic situation, and towards children, and it's quite disturbing to read about, though I think it does feel like warranted for the story, because she's writing about these real economic disparities in this community on a Caribbean island, and how on one side of the island it's kind of idyllic, sold as sort of like a tourist picture of like a perfect place, and you have these very wealthy people, and then you have the other side of the island of really impoverished people living in shacks on the fringes of society, and doing the real grunt work for the rich people that come to holiday in this community, that take advantage of them. There are women and men that prostitute themselves to these tourists that come to the island, and so there's lots of dark subject matter, and I think it does get into that in an interesting way, but the overall tone of the novel felt quite uneven to me. It did jostle around at some points, and I felt like the narrative could have been better controlled and more streamlined to tell this story, but on the whole I felt it was quite effective and moving, but just one that I wouldn't want to revisit anytime soon, because it is quite a difficult read because of the seriousness of the subject matter. And finally, for the Women's Prize, I read Consent by Annabelle Lyon, and this novel, I had quite an uneven reading experience with it, in that at first I was really interested and quite gripped by it. The story of these two sets of sisters in quite different, who have quite different relationships with each other, but who are both from quite privileged backgrounds, and following the paths of their stories over the course of a number of years. And at first it seems, well, it's left unclear what is the connection between these two pairs of sisters, and then as the story goes along and the plot develops, you suddenly realize at one point, oh, this is the connection between them. And I thought, like, oh, that's an interesting choice, I wonder how that's going to play out. But then how it plays out is more just in a revenge thriller type way, which I felt sort of undermined the story and my emotional investment in the characters. I just didn't find it very effective how this ultimately played out, and which I thought was sort of a shame. I wish it had just stayed more with the complexity, the emotional complexity of these characters' lives, in their grief and in their bitterness, and the antagonistic relationships they had with their sisters and with themselves, and rather than going into this sort of revenge plot line. I felt like in this similar, that this was trying to make some feminist statements, but in a way that I just didn't feel was like entirely effective. Sort of similar to the movie Promising Young Woman, if you've seen that, which is kind of a feminist movie and is making an interesting statement about a very serious subject, but the way it goes about it felt like, yeah, too like revenge thrillerish to me to be really effective, and yeah, and I just felt really similarly about this novel Consent. And so yeah, it's sort of an interesting writer, but one that wasn't entirely effective for me. And finally, the last book that I completed this month was a book which has been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, and that's A Room Made of Leaves by Kate Grenville, which is about a woman in the late 1700s who marries a man quite spontaneously, when, well, not spontaneously, but she gets knocked up basically, and then finds that she has to marry this man that she doesn't actually know all that much about, and turns out that he's, you know, not really the man that she thought he would be, and yeah, and who is he's quite a horrible man in some ways, but I thought it was interesting how Grenville depicts him in quite like a rounded way, and so you do see him in sort of a sympathetic light in some degrees, even though on the whole he's quite like horrible misogynistic man, and yeah, and they shouldn't be in a marriage with each other, but they're sort of stuck with each other, and basically they go to New South Wales. He's in the army, and he's joins as part of this colonization of New South Wales during that time, which was very rural, was sort of like the Wild West, and was just helping establish a colony there, and trying to make a name for himself, and you know, he went there for sort of capitalist reasons to find a position for himself that he couldn't in England, and yeah, and so I thought it was really interesting how she depicts the delicacy of how this woman learns to sort of finesse this relationship she has with her husband to work for her, or to mold in a way that can work for her, even though it's not an ideal relationship at all. And eventually she's able to achieve some independence and some self-sufficiency, even though she's so dependent on the marriage, but they can be apart from each other, and she can have a life for herself within the realms of this marriage. And I thought that was really interesting how she did that, and also the way she how this novel is framed all around the native people in Australia, and how they have really been displaced, how, you know, this is really a novel about the beginnings of the colonization of Australia, and how the native people have been displaced, and it a later scene in the novel depicts a battle between the native people, and how the events of that battle have been sort of massaged in the history books to give a certain interpretation of that, and yeah, and so I thought that was quite effective how she maintains this message about this historic story, that's really the overarching message within this much more concentrated tale of this woman trying to achieve some independence or sense of selfhood outside of this marriage which she's really trapped in. So yeah, on the whole, I thought it was quite an effective novel. Also quite a beautiful cover, and has really beautiful insides of the book as well. And so yeah, it's the first book I've read by Kate Grenville. I'd like to read more by her, because yeah, I thought it was a really interesting book overall. And then finally, I'm still in the midst of reading a couple books that have been shortlisted for the actually, have they both been shortlisted? Maybe they haven't both been shortlisted, but were both longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, which is Mordieu by Alex Feby and A Ghost in the Throat by Torian Negrofa. Is that how you pronounce it? I can never remember. But anyway, I'm way through both of these books, which are quite different from each other. A Ghost in the Throat is a tale about modern motherhood, and a woman who is a poet translating this Irish poet, this famous Irish poet from hundreds of years ago, who she feels this real psychic connection with, and in a really interesting way. And then Mordu is this fantasy novel, literary fantasy novel, which is about this strange city called Mordu, which has a lot of slums in it and focuses on the perspective of a slum boy whose father is very ill, and whose mother basically forces him out to earn money to get medicine for his father, and so follows that story. And there's all sorts of strange and interesting things about this land. And so at first I found it quite disorientating, but now I'm getting more into the story. I'm like 150 or so pages into it, and so feeling like I'm understanding this fantastical world a bit better and getting into it more. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that. But yeah, it's still quite early days for it. So that's what I've been reading. Yeah, lots of prize books. It's always feels quite uncertain about whether I should concentrate on book prize books or not, because sometimes it feels like assigned reading, but then at the same time I don't have to be doing this. I'm doing it just for fun, but and so obviously I could go off and read something else if I want to, but yeah, at the same time I often find in prize lists some of the best books that I've read all year, and as I have done with some of these prize lists. So yeah, I think definitely worth reading them and exploring them more. But yeah, I'd love to hear about what you've been reading over the month of April, whether it's a prize book or not a prize book, and so yeah, let me know about it in the comments below. Or if you've read any of the books that I've talked about and you have thoughts about them, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about those as well. But yeah, hope you're doing well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye.